Good evening, everybody, and I'd like to welcome everybody back for another session of Let's Read, or read, or whatever you'd like to think of this. We have a different name this time, since this Christmas when I started this, and, well, that's all. All's well as ends well. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the reading and what we are reading. Now, last time I did do a demo recording of a part of this book, which I'm going to try and read through. And we're starting off today with a story called The Mask. And this is read from the book known as The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. And this book was written in, let's see here. Yeah, you're getting everything here, warts and all. But that's just how we roll, you know. This is supposed to be a sort of relaxing intermission from the staged everything that you get on YouTube these days. So I'm just going to go with the flow. So The King in Yellow, this is what Wikipedia tells me, in addition to the things that I'm, in fact, going to read to you. It's a book of short stories by the American writer Robert W. Chambers, and it was first published in 1895, so this is an old one. And the book is named after a play with the same title, which recurs as a motif throughout some of the stories. The first half of the book features some highly esteemed weird stories, and the book has been described by critics such as E.F. Blyler, S.T. Yoshi, and I don't know who these people are, as a classic in the field of the supernatural. Now, from what I've read myself, is that The King in Yellow is a forbidden play, which does interesting things to people who read it. And worth noting is that I'm not sure if this is officially, well, not officially, of course. I believe there is noted somewhere that H.P. Lovecraft read The King in Yellow. And has borrowed some of his methodology and how he speaks about the unnameable horrors, and which is pretty obvious when you read a part into it. Anyway, with that, I think we'll get right into it. And you'll notice that at this point, that there's no live image here. No live image. And there is a reason for that. The main reason, of course, is that this is not about looking at me reading. This is about listening. And if you have a YouTube premium subscription or something similar where you can just read this or listen to this, then that's perfect. You won't be wasting a lot of bandwidth on a lot of moving images. I'm not sure that affects it that much, really, but this is how we're going to go about this. So, with no further ado, I will start reading the first story that we are going to read, which is The Mask. Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed? Casilda, indeed, it's time. We have all laid aside our disguises, but you. Stranger, but I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda, no mask? No mask! The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. Chapter 1. Although I know nothing of chemistry, I listened with fascination. He picked up an Easter lily, which Genevieve had brought that morning from Notre Dame, and dropped it into the basin. Instantly, the liquid lost its crystalline clearness, and for a second the lily was enveloped in milk-white foam, which disappeared, leaving the fluid opalescent. Changing tints of orange and crimson played over the surface, and then what seemed to be a ray of pure sunlight struck through from the bottom where the lily was resting. At the same time, he plunged his hand into the basin and drew out the flower. "There is no danger," he explained, "if you choose the right moment. The golden rays the signal." He held the lily toward me, and I took it in my hand. It had turned to stone, to the purest marble. "You see," he said, "it is without flaw. What sculptor could reproduce it?" The marble was as white as snow, but in its depths the veins of the lily were tinged with the palest azure, and a faint flush lingered deep in its heart. "Don't ask me the reason of that," he smiled, noticing my wonder. "I have no idea why the veins and heart are tinted, but they always are. Yesterday I tried one of Genevieve's goldfish. There it is." The fish looked as if sculpted in marble, but if you held it to the light, the stone was beautifully veined and with a faint blue, and from somewhere within came a rosy light like the tint which slumbers in an opal. I looked into the basin. Once more, it seemed filled with the clearest crystal. "What if I should touch it now?" I demanded. "I don't know," he replied. "But you had better not try." "Then there's one thing I'm curious about," I said, "and that is where the ray of sunlight came from." "It looked like a sunbeam, true enough," he said, "and I don't know. It always comes when I immerse any living thing. Perhaps," he continued, smiling, "perhaps it is the vital spark of the creature escaping to the source from whence it came." I saw that he was mocking, and threatened him with a mahl stick, but he only laughed and changed the subject. "Stay to lunch. Genevieve will be here directly." "I saw her going to early mass," I said, "and she looked as fresh and sweet as that lily. Well, before you destroyed it." "Do you think I destroyed it?" said Boris gravely. "Destroyed, preserved, how can we tell?" We sat in the corner of a studio near his unfinished group of the Fates. He leaned back on the sofa, twirling a sculptor's chisel and squinting at his work. "By the way," he said, "I have finished pointing up that old academic Ariadne, and I suppose it will have to go to the Salon. It's all I have ready this year anyway, but after the success that the Madonna brought me, I feel ashamed to send a thing like that." The Madonna, an exquisite marble for which Genevieve had sat, had been the sensation of last year's Salon. I looked at the Ariadne. It was a magnificent piece of technical work, but I agreed with Boris that the world would expect something better of him than that. Still, it was impossible now to think of finishing in time for the Salon. That splendid, terrible group, half shrouded in the marble behind me. The Fates would have to wait. We were proud of Boris Yvan. We claimed him, and he claimed us on the strength of his having been born in America. Although his father was French and his mother was Russian. Everyone in the Beaux Arts called him Boris, and yet there were only two of us with whom he addressed in the same familiar way, Jack Scott and myself. Perhaps my being in love with Genevieve had something to do with his affection for me. Not that it had ever been acknowledged between us, but after all was settled, and she had told me with the tears in her eyes that it was Boris whom she loved, I went over to her house and congratulated him. The perfect cordiality of that interview did not deceive either of us, as I always believed, although to one, at least, it was a great comfort. I do not think he and Genevieve ever spoke of the matter together, but Boris knew. Genevieve was lovely. The Madonna-like purity of her face might have been inspired by the Sanctus in Jeonad's Mass. But I was always glad when she changed that mood for what we called her April maneuvers. She was often as variable as an April day. Pardon me. In the morning, grave, dignified and sweet, at noon laughing, capricious, at evening whatever one at least expected. I preferred her so rather than in that Madonna-like tranquility which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Genevieve when he spoke again. So, what do you think of my discovery, Alec? I think it wonderful. I shall make no use of it, beyond satisfying my own curiosity so far as it may be, and the secret will die with me. It would be rather a blow to sculpture, would it not? We painters lose more than we ever gain by photography. Boris nodded, playing with the edge of the chisel. This new vicious discovery would corrupt the world of art. No, I shall never confide the secret to anyone, he said slowly. It would be hard to find anyone less informed about such phenomena than myself. But of course I had heard of mineral springs so saturated with silica that the leaves and twigs which fell into them were turned into stone after a time. I dimly comprehended the process, how the silica replaced the vegetable matter, atom by atom, and the result was a duplicate of the object in stone. This, I confess, had never interested me greatly, and as for the ancient fossils thus produced, they disgusted me. Boris, it appeared, feeling curiosity instead of repugnance, had investigated the subject and had accidentally stumbled on a solution which, attacking the immersed object with a ferocity unheard of, in a second did the work of years. This was all I could make out of the very strange story he had just been telling me. He spoke again after a long silence. I'm almost frightened when I think what I have found. Scientists would go mad over the discovery, and it was so simple too. It discovered itself. When I think of that formula and that new element precipitated in metallic scales... What new element? Oh, I haven't thought of naming it, and I don't believe I ever shall. There are enough precious metals now in the world to cut throats over. I pricked up my ears. Have you struck gold, Boris? No, better. But see here, Alec, he laughed, starting up. You and I have all we need in this world. Ah, how sinister and covetous you look already. I laughed too, and told him I was devoured by the desire for gold. And we had better talk of something else, so that when Genevieve came in shortly after, we had turned our backs on alchemy. Genevieve was dressed in silvery grey from head to foot, the light glinting along the soft curves of her fair hair as she turned her cheek to Boris. Then she saw me and returned my greeting. She had never before failed to blow me a kiss from the tips of her white fingers, and I promptly complained of the omission. She smiled and held out her hand, which dropped almost before we had touched mine. Then she said, looking at Boris, "You must ask Alec to stay for luncheon." This was also something new. She had always asked me herself until today. "I did," said Boris shortly. "And you said yes, I hope?" She turned to me with a charming, conventional smile. I might have been an acquaintance of the day before yesterday. I made her a low bow. "J'avais bien l'honneur, madame." But refusing to take up our usual bantering tone, she murmured a hospitable commonplace and disappeared. Boris and I looked at each other. "I had better go home, don't you think?" I asked. "Hanged if I know," he replied frankly. While we were discussing the advisability of my departure, Genevieve reappeared in the doorway without her bonnet. She was wonderfully beautiful, but her color was too deep and her lovely eyes were too bright. She came straight up to me and took my arm. "Luncheon is ready." Was I cross, Alec? "I thought I had a headache, but I haven't. Come here, Boris." And she slipped her other arm through his. "Alec knows that after you there is no one in the world whom I like as well as him, so he sometimes feels snubbed. It won't hurt him." "À la bonne heure," I cried. "Who says there are no thunderstorms in April?" "Are you ready?" chanted Boris. "Aye, ready." And arm in arm we raced into the dining room, scandalizing the servants. After all, we were not so much to blame. Genevieve was 18, Boris was 23, and I not quite 21. Chapter 2. Some work that I was doing about this time on the decorations for Genevieve's boudoir kept me constantly at the quaint little hotel in the Rue Sainte-Cécile. Boris and I, in those days, labored hard but as we pleased, which was fitfully, and we all three, with Jack Scott, idled a great deal together. One quiet afternoon I had been wandering alone over the house, examining curios, prying into odd corners, bringing out sweetmeats and cigars from strange hiding places, and at last I stopped in the bathing room. Boris, all over clay, stood there washing his hands. The room was built of rose-colored marble, excepting the floor, which was tessellated in rose and grey. In the center was a square pool sunken below the surface of the floor. Steps led down into it, sculptured pillars supporting a frescoed ceiling. A delicious marble Cupid appeared to have just alighted on its pedestal at the upper end of the room. The whole interior was Boris's work, and mine. Boris, in his working clothes of white canvas, scraped the traces of clay and red modeling wax from his handsome hands and coquetted over his shoulder with the Cupid. "I see you," he insisted. "Don't try to look the other way and pretend not to see me. You know who made you, little humbug." It was always my role to interpret Cupid's sentiments into these conversations, and when my turn came, I responded in such a manner that Boris seized my arm and dragged me toward the pool, declaring that he would duck me. Next instant, he dropped my arm and turned pale. "Good God," he said, "I forgot the pool is full of the solution." I shivered a little and dryly advised him to remember better where he had stored the precious liquid. "In heaven's name, why do you keep a small lake of that gruesome stuff here, of all places?" I asked. "I want to experiment on something large," he replied. "On me, for instance?" "Ah, that came too close for jesting, but I do want to watch the action of that solution on a more highly organized living body. There is that big white rabbit," he said, following me into the studio. Jack Scott, wearing a paint-stained jacket, came wandering in, appropriated all the oriental sweetmeats he could lay his hands on, looted the cigarette case, and finally he and Boris disappeared together to visit the Luxembourg Gallery, where a new silver bronze by Rodin and a landscape of Monet were claiming the exclusive attention of artistic France. I went back to the studio and resumed my work. It was a Renaissance screen, which Boris wanted me to paint for Genevieve's boudoir, but the small boy who was unwillingly dawdling through a series of poses for it today refused all bribes to be good. He never rested an instant in the same position, and inside of 5 minutes I had as many different outlines of the little beggar. "Are you posing, or are you executing a song and dance, my friend?" I inquired. "Whichever monsieur pleases," he replied with an angelic smile. Of course I dismissed him for the day, and of course I paid him for the full time, that being the way we spoil our models. After the young imp had gone, I made a few perfunctory dabs at my work, but was so thoroughly out of humor that it took me the rest of the afternoon to undo the damage I had done. So at least I scraped my palette, stuck my brushes in a bowl of black soap, and strolled into the smoking room. I really believe that, excepting Genevieve's apartments, no room in the house was so free from the perfume of tobacco as this one. It was a queer chaos of odds and ends, hung with threadbare tapestry. A sweet-toned old spinet in good repair stood by the window. There were stands of weapons, some old and dull, others bright and modern, festoons of Indian and Turkish armor over the mantel, 2 or 3 good pictures, and a pipe rack. It was here that we used to come for new sensations in smoking. I doubt if any type of pipe ever existed which was not represented in that rack. When we had selected one, we immediately carried it somewhere else and smoked it, for the place was, on the whole, more gloomy and less inviting than any in the house. But this afternoon, the twilight was very soothing, and the rugs and skins on the floor looked brown and soft and drowsy. The big couch was piled with cushions. I found my pipe and curled up there for an unaccustomed smoke in the smoking room. I had chosen one with a long, flexible stem, and lighting it fell to dreaming. After a while it went out, but I did not stir. I dreamed, and presently fell asleep. I awoke to the saddest music I had ever heard. The room was quite dark. I had no idea what time it was, and a ray of moonlight silvered one edge of the old spinet, and the polished wood seemed to exhale the sounds as perfume floats above a box of sandalwood. Someone rose in the darkness and came away weepingly quiet, and I was fool enough to cry out, "Genevieve!" She dropped at my voice, and I had time to curse myself while I made a light and tried to raise her from the floor. She shrank away with a murmur of pain. She was very quiet and asked for Boris. I carried her to the divan and went to look for him, but he was not in the house, and the servants were gone to bed. Perplexed and anxious, I hurried back to Genevieve. She lay where I had left her, looking very white. "I can't find Boris, nor any of the servants," I said. "I know," she answered faintly. "Boris has gone to Ept with Mr. Scott. I did not remember when I sent you for him just now. But he can't get back in that case before tomorrow afternoon. And are you hurt? Did I frighten you into falling? What an awful fool I am, but I was only half awake." "Boris thought you had gone home before dinner. Do please excuse us for letting you stay here all this time. I have had a long nap," I laughed, so sound that I did not know whether I was still asleep or not when I found myself staring at a figure that was moving toward me, and called out your name. "Have you been trying the old spinet? You must have been playing very softly." I would tell 1,000 more lies worse than that, to see the look of relief that came into her face. She smiled adorably and said in her natural voice, "Alec, I tripped on that wolf's head, and I think my ankle is sprained. Please, call Marie, and then go home." I did as she bade me, and left her there when the maid came in. Chapter 3. At noon next day, when I called, I found Boris walking restlessly about his studio. "Genevieve is asleep just now," he told me. "The sprain is nothing, but why should she have such a high fever? The doctor can't account for it, or else he will not," he muttered. "Genevieve has a fever?" I asked. "I should say so, and has actually been a little light-headed at intervals all night. The idea! Gay little Genevieve, without a care in the world, and she keeps saying her heart's broken, and she wants to die." My own heart stood still. Boris leaned against the door of his studio, looking down, his hands in his pockets, his kind, keen eyes clouded, a new line of trouble drawn over the mouth's good mark that made the smile. The maid had orders to summon him the instant Genevieve opened her eyes. We waited and waited, and Boris, growing restless, wandered about, fussing with modeling wax and red clay. Suddenly he started for the next room. "Come and see my rose-colored bath full of death," he cried. "Is it death?" I asked, to humor his mood. "You are not prepared to call it life, I suppose?" he answered. As he spoke, he plucked a solitary goldfish squirming and twisting out of its globe. "We'll send this one after the other, wherever it is," he said. There was a feverish excitement in his voice. A dull weight of fever lay on my limbs and on my brain as I followed him to the fair crystal pool with its pink-tinted sides, and he dropped the creature in. Falling, its scales flashed with a hot orange gleam in its angry twistings and contortions. The moment it struck the liquid, it became rigid and sank heavily to the bottom. Then came the milky foam, the splendid hues radiating on the surfaces, and then the shaft of pure serene light broke through, from seemingly infinite depths. Boris plunged in his hand and drew out an exquisite marble thing, blue-veined, rose-tinted, and glistening with opalescent drops. "Child's play," he muttered, and looked warily, longingly at me, as if I could answer such questions. But Jack Scott came in and entered into the game, as he called it, with ardor. Nothing would do but try the experiment on the white rabbit then and there. I was willing that Boris should find distraction from his cares, but I hated to see the life go out of a warm, living creature, and I declined to be present. Picking up a book at random, I sat down in the studio to read. Alas, I had found The King in Yellow. After a few moments, which seemed ages, I was putting it away with a nervous shudder, when Boris and Jack came in bringing their marble rabbit. At the same time, the bell rang above, and a cry came from the sick room. Boris was gone like a flash, and the next moment he called, "Jack, run for the doctor! Bring him back with you! Alec, come here!" I went and stood at her door. A frightened maid came out in haste and ran away to fetch some remedy. Genevieve, sitting bolt upright, with crimson cheeks and glittering eyes, babbled incessantly and resisted Boris' gentle restraint. He called me to help. At my first touch, she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes. And then, as we still bent above her, she opened them again, looking straight into Boris' face, poor fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. At the same instant, our 3 lives turned into new channels. The bond that held us so long together snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place, for she had spoken my name. And as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head, while my face burned like live coal, the blood surging in my ears, stupefying me with its clamor. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. And then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. "It's not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you." But he could not finish, and as the doctor stepped swiftly into the room, saying, "The fever," I seized Jack Scott and hurried him into the street, saying, "Boris would rather be alone." We crossed the street to our own apartments, and that night, seeing I was going to be ill too, he went for the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with any distinctness was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of The King in Yellow and the pallid mask. I was very ill, for the strain of 2 years which I had endured since that fatal May morning with Genevieve murmured, "I love you, but I think I love Boris best." I have never imagined that I could become more than I could endure. Outwardly tranquil, I had deceived myself. Although the inward battle raged night after night, and I, lying alone in my room, cursed myself for rebellious thoughts, unloyal to Boris and unworthy of Genevieve, the morning always brought relief. And I returned to Genevieve and to my dear Boris with a heart washed clean by the tempests of night. Never in word or deed or thought while I was with him had I betrayed my sorrow even to myself. The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me. It was a part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare the stifled truth below, but there was no one to see except myself. And when the day broke the mask, it fell back again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my troubled mind as I lay sick, but they were hopelessly entangled with visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's basin, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Genevieve, who lay smiling beside it. I thought, too, of the King in Yellow, wrapped in the fantastic colors of his tattered mantle, and that bitter cry of Casilda, not upon us, O King, not upon us." Feverishly I struggled to put it from me. But I saw the lake of Hali, thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon, Aldebaran, the Hyades, Alar, Hastur, glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the King in Yellow. Among all of these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. What this obligation was, its nature, it was never clear to me. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support through a great crisis. Whatever it seemed to be for the time, its weight rested only on me, and I was never so ill or so weak that I did not respond with my whole soul. There were always crowds of faces about me, mostly strange, but a few I recognized, Boris amongst them. Afterwards they told me that this could not have been, but I know that once at least he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice, and then the clouds settled back on my senses, and I lost him. But he did stand there and bend over me at least once. At last, one morning, I awoke to find the sunlight falling across my bed, and Jack Scott reading beside me. I had not strength enough to speak aloud, neither could I think, much less remember, but I could smile feebly, as Jack's eye met mine, and when he jumped up and asked eagerly if I wanted anything, I could whisper, "Yes, Boris." Jack moved to the head of my bed and leaned down to arrange my pillow. I did not see his face, but he answered heartily, "You must wait, Alec. You are too weak to see even Boris." I waited, and I grew strong, and in a few days I was able to see whom I would, but meanwhile I had thought and remembered. From the moment when all the past grew clear again in my mind, I never doubted what I should do when the time came, and I felt sure that Boris would have resolved upon the same course so far as he was concerned. As for what pertained to me alone, I knew he would see that also as I did. I no longer asked for anyone. I never inquired why no messages came from them, why during the week as I lay there waiting and growing stronger, I never heard their name spoken. Preoccupied with my own searchings for the right way, and with my feeble but determined fight against despair, I simply acquiesced in Jack's reticence, taking for granted that he was afraid to speak of them, lest I should turn unruly and insist on seeing them. Meanwhile, I said over and over to myself, how would it be when life began again for all of us? We would take up our relations exactly as they were before Genevieve fell ill. Boris and I would look into each other's eyes, and there would be neither rancor nor cowardice nor mistrust in that glance. I would be with them again for a little while in the dear intimacy of their home, and then, without pretext or explanation, I would disappear from their lives forever. Boris would know. Genevieve, the only comfort was that she would never know. It seemed, as I thought it over, that I had found the meaning of that sense of obligation which had persisted all through my delirium, and the only possible answer to it. So, when I was quite ready, I beckoned Jack to me one day and said, "Jack, I want Boris at once, and take my dearest greeting to Genevieve." When at last he made me understand that they were both dead, I fell into a wild rage that tore all my convalescent strength to atoms. I raved and cursed myself into a relapse, from which I crawled forth some weeks afterward, a boy of 21 who believed that his youth was gone forever. I seemed to be past the capability of further suffering, and one day when Jack handed me a letter and the keys to Boris's house, I took them without a tremor and asked him to tell me everything. It was cruel of me to ask him, but there was no help for it, and he leaned warily on his thin hands to reopen the wound that could never entirely heal. And that's where we were going to leave off for this time. I hope you enjoyed this first reading of The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, and we will be continuing again tomorrow. Thank you, and good night.